Mark the side seam balance points and hemline clearly on both of the side seams. It's really the balance points on the front that we want clear on the front inlays since we have the mark stitches. With the lining out of the way, put the appropriate sides together right side to right side, lining up each of the balance points, pinning them together before basting before machining them. Remember that there's inlay on the front side seam. Line the back piece up to the mark stitches. We can baste it first, but we don't have to. I always suggest getting both sides ready and machining them both in one sitting. Don't catch any of the lining. Machine with a 1 cm seam allowance, back tack at the top but not at the hem. Remove the basting and press the seam. We might need to stretch the inlay a bit more, and being sure that you're not stretching the stitching. Then press the seam open. Best over a ham since it's so curvy. What can I say? Though be wary that you're not stretching anything that you shouldn't be. Use a bit of steam and leave the iron on there a minute to evaporate all the water. If it's moist, it won't stay flat. Lay the front lining flat and lay the back lining as flat as possible on the side seam as well. Place the back lining on top, we'll start at the hem. It may be easier to work over a sleeve board since we need to make sure there's enough lining, that it won't be tight around, well, any point. Fold over the back lining and press it down, making sure that there isn't too much lining either, especially at the hem. I pinned the lining at the bottom of the vent so that I don't pull away too much. You need to baste the linings together. It's important that they aren't basted to the cloth. Again, not too tight, to the point that it's drawing the shell smaller. Remember that you'll fill this later, therefore you want to leave the basting stitches rather wide in order to get your fingers between them to hold the lining as you fill it. I am tacking the linings down to the rest of the jacket as well, so that it doesn't move too much for now. Doing all the same thing to the other side seam. Above the hem at the waist and under the armhole, pull on the fabric of the jacket. If the basting and the lining gets tight and pulls at all, then it's too tight and you'll need to take it out and rebaste it with slightly more ease. Putting up the vent, just start by removing the tacks we put at the bottom of the lining of the vent. Then left and right sides are done a little differently due to the different sides of the vent. You need to start with the outside side, with the vent in line with the centre back, so for the left hem. Turn up the hem along the mark stitches. Because of how we pressed it earlier, the raw edge will sit away from the folded edge. I'm pressing the hem in place first. Again, this is a difference in the vents, and why we don't mitre the corner here. The lining is right up against the fold. Basting at the edge of the vent, curve and shape the corner inwards. This will retard it from pointing outwards by pointing it inwards, continuing towards the canvas. Stitch the hem up onto the seam allowance. You don't want to catch any of the exterior fabric though, so don't bother cross-stitching along, especially on lighter material. Maybe with a heavier fabric you could, but nah. Fell stitch the bit of the hem that you turned inwards to the back inlay, still shaping it inwards. Here we are placing the lining, so mark 2 cm above the hem of the jacket. Cutting the lining free from the facing so that it's free 2 cm above the hem. Fold the lining up to meet the chalk, basting it in place about 2 cm above the fold of the lining so that we can easily finish it with a ballast. I'm also basting over the raw edges at the bottom of the facing so that it won't fray too badly until finishing. On the right hand side of the jacket, it's a lot of the same, beginning with removing the tack, fold the hem up and lay the vent flat, or closed, in order to secure the hem under the vent a little higher than the top vent, so that it tucks away and doesn't hang out from the bottom. Make it a little bit higher where the vent comes out from underneath the top of the back vent and up to 1 centimeter on the hidden side. Only up to. You only need it a small amount above. When basting this side, you should shape it in the same way we did the first, and it's tucked away from the fold because of how we pressed it a while ago. Check that it does sit the way you want it to, and once happy with your right side, secure the hem to the seam allowance and inlay, and fell the corner to the inlay. Final check that the vent is laying properly, and putting up the lining is just the same again. Iron, chalk, fold, baste. Lay the jacket out, right side up and inside out. Chalk the pitches on as well. Mark all of the lines on the shoulder and mark 1 centimeter down from the inlay on the front. Mark the back neck as well. So rechalk the mark stitches of the shoulder and mark the seam allowances. Double check the width of the shoulder and compare that to any measurements you took. If you check the back, it should be 1 centimeter longer than it is on the front. It is now important to measure our armhole circumference. Measure from the front pitch up the shoulder, staying 1 centimeter from the edge and mark stitches to the mark stitches on the shoulder. Take 1 centimeter off for the seam allowances there. Apply the measurement to the back shoulder and measure down to the back pitch. Take off 1 centimeter again and you have your top sleeve measurement from the jacket. From the back pitch to the front pitch, still 1 centimeter from the armhole. Take down both of these measurements and take measurements from both sleeves. They might differ, so make sure you know which arm is which. We'll use these when preparing the sleeves. It is important because it's possible that the fabric has stretched or shrunk slightly and we'll have to make the sleeve to fit the armhole. We need the total measurements for both armholes written down. We'll keep these with the sleeves we cut to make them later. We can stay the shoulder line. You can use lining or silecia, lining for lighter fabrics, otherwise it may show through. Cut it on the straight grain and baste it to the fabric between the canvas and the fabric. Baste it onto the cloth. Then we do a back stitch starting a bit below the top of the back shoulder, only to the fabric. This will be a permanent stitch to prevent the armhole from stretching and to strengthen it in general. As you approach the back seam around the undersleeve, begin to pull it a bit tighter in order to give it some fullness. As you stitch, there isn't any inlay. Stitch just 1/2 centimeter from the edge and then rejoin the inlay. As you cross the seam allowances and inlays, it's important that they are held open. As you approach the base of the armhole, start a new line or secure the base and stitch it flat. Realistically, I feel like I should have measured after putting fullness into the armhole. Recently I tried doing just a wide machine stitch around the armhole along the same track as I do anyway, and that seems to work out fine as well, if you want to save a bit of time. Here I am marking on the neckline and seam allowances at the neck, and I want to mark it onto both sides. I also want to mark the 1 centimeter seam onto the back on the wrong side so that I can follow it when I baste it down. Also marking the shoulder and neckline onto the front of the forepart so that the two pieces can be lined up. Lay the front right side up and the back on top of it. Make sure both sides are matching the points you drew. You could use a pin to hold them together at the neckline. Begin to baste them together through only the fabric and the stay you put in, both times from the armhole side. Don't ease in any of the extra fabric until you get to a little shy of the center. Secure the baste and begin to ease in the fabric, extending the baste to the neckline inlay. Don't baste exactly on the seam you'll sew, otherwise it'll be difficult to remove. However, if you were preparing for a fitting, you would. Then make another line of basting to even out the ease. You can do it directly on top of the first or above the seam line, or on the opposite side of the seam line. Removing the pin, steam and press in the extra cloth to make sure that the ease can be eased in. If it can't and it still bubbles and rumbles, then you've given it too much ease and you'll need to start again putting in less ease. Possibly putting in the extra cloth over a larger length of the front shoulder. Mark the centimeter line very clearly using a sharp piece of chalk. As it's machined, stitch beyond the edge of the shoulder and neckline. While machining, to keep the ease in place, you may like to hold the fabric upwards in order to stop it from being pushed and to pleat itself. Or you may like to use a bradawl or your small snips to just sort of hold it without getting your fingers too close. Back tack on both sides of the shoulders. Remove the basting and press the seam. To iron the seam open, a sleeve board would be ideal. Hold the seam open and press it flat to make sure that it's a straight line, that the fabric isn't rumpling and there aren't any kinks in the fabric. At a couple of points here, depending on what and how you may have basted earlier, you may need to cut some basting. Just do it and maybe replace it later. Double check the shoulder line and chalk on the neckline and the edge of the shoulder. From about the center of the armhole, we need to stitch the material to the canvas. Halfway along the shoulder, clean up as you baste it up, not catching the lining. Get to just beyond the shoulder seam, then cleaning towards the neckline. Shape-wise, the shoulder will sit in a concave shape, so keep that in mind as you're not giving the fabric any ease in the wrong places. Try to keep the shoulder in a concave curve over your hand to promote that shape. Tack the baste just before the neckline and still cleaning out from the baste up at the shoulder, baste down the neckline to where the pad stitching starts. I'm chalking the mark stitches around the armhole again so that I can properly line up the shoulder pad, and we can see that there's a smooth line over the seam rather than being pointy at all, which is something I tried to emphasize when I drafted the pattern. Align the front edge of the pad to the outside of the jacket to check that it doesn't infringe on the neckline. If it does, cut away a little bit. Put the pad under the canvas with the lining out of the way. Line up the center point of the pad to the shoulder line and the front edge of the pad to the mark stitches of the jacket. It's important that it's right up there, if a little ahead, which we would be able to cut away later, in order to get a clean, sharp shoulder. Baste not too close to the armhole to hold it up there about halfway along the shoulder, slip stitching the bottom of the pad, then back up to the shoulder. Check that the pad is laying how you want it to. Stitch it down the back the same way as the front. Don't stitch too tightly, otherwise you'll pull the fabric. Only enough to hold the pad in place. Check that the jacket is sitting about how we'd like it as well. To fasten the pad to the canvas, turn the jacket inside out, and without catching the fabric or the lining, stitch the pad to the canvas all the way around the front. When you get to the top, you could do a couple of stitches in the middle of the pad as well. Then we'll attach the top of the lining to the pad. Be sure that the pleat in the lining isn't open. It'll be hidden by the back lining, so the stitch is not important, just that you don't go through the front. Although given the amount there is to sew through, I'd be surprised if you managed to do it accidentally. I'm doing a final check here that the pad goes up to the inlay line, and just looking at how it hangs. I don't know what I'm looking for, but it makes it look as though I know what I'm doing.